Hello everyone, Rob Bertholf here. We're continuing in the Theological series in the study of Revelation. We're now in chapter 12. And again, what we're seeing is really this bigger picture in Revelation, really in the Bible itself as a whole, talking about the great controversy really between Christ and Satan. And in this chapter 12, we're going to be kind of really starting to see the clash come in full view, right? With the attack on Jesus, the persecution to the Dark Ages, and ultimately this chapter will lead us right up to the final conflict at the end of time. To understand this chapter, there's a lot of symbolism being used, and so I recommend my course on Bible symbolism first. But just to kind of give you the nutshell, the main things we need to know before diving into chapter 12 is simply that a woman in the Bible is a church. And there's tons of references like this. We can go, watch that course. It'll be really clear, all the Bible verses. So I'm not going to jump into them here. But just know that when we talk about a woman in the Bible, it's actually referring to a church. And so a pure woman, white, virgin woman would be the pure church, right? The true gospel. And then we're going to find in later chapters about the defiled woman, which would be the false church. Ultimately, again, so when we're talking about a woman later, we're speaking of a church, not a literal woman. That said, there is a literal application to this as well, that we saw with Eve. But just to kind of, again, set the preface of what we're talking about here in this great controversy, after Adam and Eve ultimately fell into the trap of distrust, ultimately of God, everything had changed, right? They had given away their free will and essentially sold themselves into bondage to the deceiver. But God stepped in, and we read here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that God put enmity between thee, Lucifer, and the woman, Eve, yes, but more generally, all of mankind, right? God's church. And between her seed, between thy seed, which have been Lucifer's fallen angels, their supporters that, and ultimately, as well as those that rejected God, and her seeds. This would be the children of God, specifically spiritual Israel, as well as Jesus, who came out of this lineage. So we continue here that Jesus will bruise Lucifer's head. This is a mortal wound. And thou will bruise his heel, the process of ending sin. Jesus sacrificed himself. Okay. So enmity means an act of opposition. So we see that there would be a battle between two forces, the forces of evil and the forces of darkness. Jesus, along with those who are spiritually in Jesus, right? Spiritual Israel. So we also can kind of dive in more about this enmity, right? And I think it's a good quote here is that this enmity is not natural. That when man transgressed the divine law, his nature became evil in harmony with Satan. And fallen angels and wicked men united in desperate companionship. Had God not interposed, Satan and man would have entered into an alliance against heaven. And the whole human family would have become united in opposition to God. When Satan heard that enmity would exist, right, this God would kind of create this intervention between himself and the woman, and between the woman and his seed, Lucifer knew that at some point in time, this was going to be man's way to resist him. So Christ implants in man enmity against Satan. Without this converting grace and the renewing power, man would continue a servant ever to do Satan's bidding. So I think that's kind of interesting, understanding what enmity is. Enmity is not something natural. Enmity is something that is given for us to overcome, ultimately, the power of self and the power of Lucifer. We also are going to find, and we read here in 2 Timothy 3:12, that all that live godly will ultimately suffer. So the theme ultimately that we find out through the entire chapter is whoever resists temptation will arouse the wrath of Satan. But again, we have that promise that we can just keep calm and accept Jesus and the protection that he gives. But again, we need to be understanding that the protection is, yes, here in this physical world, but even more than that, we are not to fear those that can destroy the bodies, but fear those who can destroy our soul, right? And one of the big themes that we're going to see in this chapter is more than just, there was a lot of martyrs that didn't fear going to the grave for to honor God, going to the grave, to ultimately stay true to what God has said. And they weren't afraid of this. What they were afraid of, right, ultimately was spiritual wickedness. And we read in Matthew, how we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual wickedness. Okay, so ultimately here, we are in a battle between light and dark, good and evil. Ultimately, we must choose God or choose self. With this theme in mind, let's dive into chapter 12, verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, and a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head 12 stars. Right? Just as we discussed, a pure woman in the Bible is a symbol of God's true church. So this church who gives birth to the Messiah, from Adam, the Jewish nation to the Christian church, right? This ultimately is the woman we're speaking of here. We visualize her clothed with the sun, right? And this is the glory of the gospel of Christ, right? Jesus being the light and having the moon under her feet. The moon is the faithful witness. The lesser light, which reflects the light of the sun, S-O-N, S-U-N, right? The moon is reflected glory of Christ that we can find in the Old Testament. Ultimately, all of the sanctuary services and rituals were pointing forward, right? They're a reflection of what Jesus was doing for us in heaven. So what we kind of keep seeing here is that, the moon, which is that lesser light, the Old Testament, this is what the woman is grounded on, right? The woman who is the church, the bride of Christ. We read kind of, 2 Corinthians as well as Jeremiah, right? And she's being clothed in Jesus' light, right? So she's clothed in the light of Jesus, Jesus being the light of the world. All of this is kind of symbolism here. Again, the moon, we read in Psalms 89:37, the moon is a faithful witness. And again, Colossians 2:17 specifically, it is a shadow of things to come. So that's kind of the premise of what we're looking at here. And we read on to find out that she is with child, right? So she's, we find out that she's pregnant, right? She wants to deliver. This, again, is out of God's people. The Messiah would come. We're introduced to this idea of birthing a church, birthing a nation, but specifically birthing, as well as birthing the Messiah, right? So we're introduced to a new element in verse 3. It says, a great dragon, right? A red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. So who is this great dragon? We find out in Revelation 12, verse 9, that the great dragon is identified as the serpent, as the devil, as Satan. So ultimately fallen, Lucifer in a fallen state is now, we have our little rubric here, right, of who this, all these different names mean. We also see the serpent included in Genesis 3, right? In Genesis 3, the serpent is the one that is, that old serpent is the one that brought the first lie. And so, again, this is about this deceiving power who's, making war against, the seeds of Jesus, and he's doing that through his heads. And so we're going to read about this in a second, because the heads are ultimately both nations and people who the deceiver used to persecute, to deceive, and destroy. And we learn this kind of similarity between Daniel 7 and 13, which describes ultimately a similar beast, right? And so here's Daniel seeing in Revelation 13:1, and I stood upon the sands of a sea, and I saw a beast rise out of the sea, a sea being multitudes, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And ultimately we find out that this beast, those 7 heads were the number of the kingdoms that we saw in Daniel 2, right? So we're seeing the same symbology here of Babylon and Medo-Persia and Greece and Rome and then papal Rome, right? All of these are ultimately with the dragon being being the little horn that comes out of papal Rome here. So what we're seeing is the same symbology. This instance is the powers that Lucifer uses. And in the previous chapter here, and the previous, in Revelation 12:9, we're actually seeing Lucifer ultimately and the horns that he's bringing about, how he's bringing this about. Let's continue verse 4. And Lucifer's tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. In the Bible, a tail represents lies. We see this in Isaiah 9:15. So Lucifer's tail, or Lucifer's lies, which took a third part of the angels, right? So this is the stars of heaven would be the heavenly angels. So Lucifer's lies made 33% of the angels in heaven doubt that God was actually loving and fair. Notice that they were not actually cast out of the courtroom, but as a jury goes, 33% sided, sympathized with Lucifer. Now let's check the second part of this verse now. So going back again, verse 4. Here we see an attempt to destroy Jesus at his birth. And we can identify, how pagan Rome, right, through the person of King Herod, is the agency of Satan, working through to kill this child that came out. Right? We remember that story of how Herod, killed all the firstborn in the land, trying to kill Jesus. So shortly, in verse 6, these dragon forces the woman to flee into the wilderness for this 1260 years, in which we're going to get to in a little bit. So ultimately, what we've just seen here, though, is the man-child, which is Jesus, is brought forth, and Lucifer tries to destroy God. And she, reading in verse 5, and she, which is Israel, brought forth a man-child, which is Jesus, who was, now notice we're in future tense here, to rule all nations. Right? So here we see Jesus' birth from the lineage of, ultimately, of Israel, of Abraham, of David, comes the Messiah. And this man-child, Jesus, was caught up to God. So now this is the resurrection, ascension, and ultimately he would be crowned king, claiming his throne, and all the rules, and would rule all the nations. So this we can kind of see the future tense of who was to rule. That's a future. So Jesus ultimately died, resurrected, ascended to heaven, and was crowned king. And so we know that this happened in 31 AD, which is when Jesus ascended into heaven, because it's the same time as the Pentecost. So let's continue in verse 6. And the woman, which is spiritual Israel, the true worshipers of God, fled to the wilderness. Now this is a literal event, which we'll speak to shortly, for a period of 1260 years. Right? So we see this, that we keep seeing this 1260 threescore days, right? Using the prophetic day for a year would be 1260 years. But the same time period keeps popping up, right? This 1260 years is the same period spoken in Daniel 7 and 12, in Revelation 11, as well as in chapter 12 and 12 chapter 13, right? So we kind of see how all speak the same time period, a time, a times, half a time, right? And that would be ultimately 42 months and 1260 days. All of these are the same exact time period. So ultimately what we're finding out is that it's the same time period as we saw in Daniel. It's this 1260 year period, 538 AD to 1798. Now we've covered these numbers many other times, so if you've watched the previous chapter, you're already familiar with this. Ultimately, this is a time where papal Rome had complete supremacy, and how Lucifer was able to bring about a dark ages and ban the Bible and do these horrible things. And ultimately, this is where the devil is given key to rule the bottomless pit, is one of the previous chapters we read, right? He's able to show what his rule fully looks like. And the woman, the church, fled into the wilderness. So in a literal sense, the Waldensians, the Albigensians, right, they fled into the mountains to escape persecution and maintain religious liberty. In a spiritual sense, the woman, right, the church, which was forced into hiding through this horrific persecution from Satan, right, and his supporters, right, this ultimately becomes a spiritual sense for the church as a whole during this time period of 1260 years. We read in Inspiration that Satan had revealed himself a liar and was a murderer and was at the slaying of Jesus on the cross, and further demonstrated his cruelty during these time periods, right, when he continued to persecute the church. So let's go verse 7 and 9. We'll take them break these in pieces. And there was a court case, and this was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. So this great court case in heaven ultimately was that judging if God is fair, right? Now this had been started before the earth was created, Lucifer and his supporters ultimately were then, once this any remaining link of sympathy was removed, through all this persecution, through ultimately the crucifixion of Christ, Lucifer was cast out. Now, we read this in the next verse in 12:7, and there was a great war, a case in heaven, and the question, though, becomes, who's Michael in all of this, right? So it says Michael and his angels. So what we're looking at is, if we look up the Hebrew, which is translated to who is like God, and there's many references to this name in the Bible. So again, the great court case, Michael and the unfallen angels made arguments against Lucifer and his supporters, and we find out that Michael is Jesus, right? We see here, Daniel 10:21, Michael is your prince. Other translations, Michael is your ruler, or who is the ruler of God's people, right? That's Jesus. Daniel 12:1, before the time of trouble, Michael will stand up, who is the great prince, and will stand for the children of, so who is this great prince, right? It's Jesus, right? Jude 9, Michael argues over the body of Moses. Who else other than Jesus can argue over death, right? So again, he calls Jesus the archangel. So in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, we see that the Lord himself is the voice of the archangel. And the archangel being the highest, it's kind of the highest, beings here. We see Jesus obviously is God. Also, John 5:28 speaks the voice of God that rises the dead. Ultimately, an angel is defined as a messenger, not a race. So the highest messenger is Jesus, who's declaring the love of God. We see in Genesis 48:16, where Jesus, who is the only one who can redeem us from the evil, is called the angel. And again, in Isaiah 63:9, it also confirms that the angel of the presence was afflicted and redeemed of mankind. So this can only be Jesus. So we learn that again. Michael is Jesus. So again, to paraphrase one more time, there was a great court case in heaven. Jesus' angels argued against the accusations charged by the devil and his supporters. This case went on, but as we learn that after seeing Lucifer kill Jesus on the cross, all sympathy was lost, and they were sent down to heaven. Now he fights against Christ by attacking his people, his truth, and his character. And we find this in 1 Peter 5:8. So let's continue in verse 10. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren, which has accused them before God day and night, is cast down. Right? So the heavens are rejoicing because the court case of God's character is over. Lucifer is defeated, but then Lucifer is, mounting his attacks. And so we also find out, how was Lucifer defeated? Well, it was through the blood of the Lamb. And we find that in verse 11. Jesus, in his life on earth, was a witness to the character of God, right? The world saw that God was truly love, but this also applies to the martyrs who demonstrate the same character of Christ, who are willing to sacrifice their life rather than dishonor God. So again, this is what we see here, and he overcame Lucifer, right, by the blood of the Lamb. This is the character of Christ, and then who then died, 31 AD, and by the word of their testimony. Now the testimony is, now we're speaking of the church, right, and that they loved not the world. This is the martyrs that loved God more than their lives themselves. And this is, especially moving up into 313 AD, where, that was, the worst Diocletian persecution. Okay. Therefore, rejoice, ye heavens, that dwell in them. Well, woe is the inhabitants of the earth, though, right? For the devil's come down to them, having a great wrath, because he knows he only has a short amount of time. So the rejoicing in heaven is over their victory, but then Satan turns his wrath and intensifies it, because he knows he's only given 1,260 days of papal dominion, which will go quickly, and also he knows he's coming up against the 6,000 years of end of time. And when the dragon saw that he was cast under the earth, and he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child, that whenever Christians remain true, ultimately, and don't compromise their beliefs, that angers Lucifer. And Satan is going to be aroused to want to persecute them. And we find out that the whole church was forced to flee to an inhabited wilderness for a time, times and half a time, right? We're going to get that 1200 year period of papal domination. And that's where we find that millions of Christians were martyred during this time period. Millions. They chose to obey what God said through the Bible rather than the decrees of popes and church councils, right? The mountains in Europe and also in Africa and Asia became their refuge. And then ultimately we find out that the new land of America seemed divinely ordained even as a stronghold of religious freedom. In this image here we have the map of the Waldensian valleys of Piedmont, but there was also the Albigensians. There was a lot of different people during this time, but specifically this group who ultimately carried the torch of God's true light. And I highly recommend learning more about these two groups who gave their life to preserve the Bible and the lineage of true Christianity. And I actually go into this much more in my course on protesting paganism, but let's continue in verse 14. And to the church was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she may fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished. And so what do wings represent? Well, healing and nourishment. And let's read this in Malachi 4, verse 2. The Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and shall go to for you forth, and etc. So healing comes from the symbol of God's wings. So let's continue here. We see that they would be nourished, right? This healing, they're nourished for time, times, and half a time. Again, same timeline as we saw before. We're going to look at it one more time here. We know that a Jewish year, right, ultimately would be time. 2 times would be 2 Jewish years. Half a time would be a half a year, so that's 3.5 Jewish years. And we know that a year has 360 days in the Jewish time. So ultimately, we're looking at doing the math on that is 1,260 days. Using the biblical time prophecy of 1 day is 1 year, we get to 1,260 years. And interestingly, this is the same time period we just saw in verse 6. Okay, again, it's the same thing repeating over and over. We see this in Daniel 7 again. So it's the same thing, and it's really showing this powerful time that the devil was given the key to the bottomless pit, and just the persecution that happened was relentless through this time. So let's take this verse in 2 parts again. We're now in 15 and 16. And Satan cast out of his mouth water as a flood unto the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. Now, what does water mean in the Bible? So water ultimately we find refers, we can kind of see in Revelation 17:15, that the waters that thou sawest were people, multitude, nations, and tongues. Water are people. So these are those that Lucifer was using to persecute God's true church. But it says that this flood was swallowed up. Right? Let's read the second half of this verse. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So the dragon cast out a flood. So he had tons of people persecuting, but these people were swallowed up by the earth. So where did these people not go? And we need to look into what was happening around the time period to see what this could be. Ultimately, how could the earth protect the church, right, and religious liberty? Well, Daniel gives us that answer. We read that there came another beast, not from the sea, but this time from the earth. Similar to what we just read in verse 16, right? Sea being people, so not out of the sea means that the beast would not be coming out of a densely populated area. And it had 2 horns like a lamb. This refers to the republicanism, right? A government without a king, hence no crown on this beast. And the Protestantism would be the second horn, and this is a church without a pope. Now, other nations since ancient times had taxed people to support our state religion. Most had oppressed religious dissidents, but the United States established something entirely new, right? The freedom to worship without government interference. Now, the United States declared its independence in 1776, voted on the Constitution in 1787, adopted the Bill of Rights in 1791, and this is clearly recognized as a world power when this time period ended in 1798. So the swallowing up of the flood refers to a new place where religious liberty could flourish, the United States. Final verse, for chapter 12, Verse 17 we read, "And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keepeth the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." So the lesson here is that this persecution will continue to go on. Satan does not want to stop persecuting the true church. He sees, we can see who the true church is, right? It's those who keep the law of God and those who have the character of Christ. And so Lucifer needs to destroy the law of God and destroy those who are a testimony to the law of God. In Daniel 12:1, it makes it clear that this persecution would only intensify as the world comes to a close. And really, this is just this is the moving into the next chapter. We're going to see this, but just to recap chapter 12 here, is that we begin with a 1260-year period, and that was the fourth trumpet, right? We read previously. Then continues with a period where the earth helped the woman. Right? This is the religious liberty in America, in the early years anyway, ending with verse 17 being a description of the sixth trumpet. So we start in the fourth trumpet, into the sixth trumpet, and throughout this chapter we see that persecution of the remnant is going to be done by the enemies of God. But the overall theme, again, is it's a battle between light and dark and good and evil. So this is really just to go quickly over the top of this chapter. You can go in much, much more detail. Highly recommend Walter Weiss commentary on this. Check out his Battle of the Giants video in Total Onslaught. Highly recommend Stephen Bohr, his notes on Revelation 12 in his Secrets Unsealed series. Really great resources. And next we're going to tackle really chapter 13, where we see more clearly who is this individual that Lucifer is using to bring about his work on earth. Hope this was a blessing to you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. Take care, everyone.